Okay, great. So I'm going to go ahead and get started because typically our lunch and learn programs are really short programs that we do just to spit out some, information that we have that we are anxious to share with the public. So thank you all for being here on this very special day where we recognize our great service leader and just so many other things, Dr. Martin Luther King. My name is Sabria Hassan, and I am the Director of Programs at the Banneker-Douglass Museum, located in downtown Annapolis, Maryland. But of course, we come to you here today on a virtual platform to talk about the preservation of protests. Of course, the title of the program is Preserving the Protests. And we're discussing protest art, memorabilia, just different artifacts and things that we collect along the way. And what better way to honor Dr. King and the civil rights movement than talking about how we ourselves can be, doing something now here in the present as we go through what for me has been one of the biggest social justice movements of my time. So I'm not going to be long in my introduction. Again, I just want to welcome you all and thank you all for taking this time out and coming today. And I'm actually going to hand the program over to our presenter for the day, Ms. Schillica Howard. And I also towards the end of the program, we will have a question and answer portion of the program, something that we usually don't do with Lunch and Learns, but we figured because Schillica will be presenting such great information, some of you may have questions, some of you may even want to share some artifacts or art that you all have collected along the way. So we're going to save that portion of the program until that'll happen at about 12:40. But what you can do in the meantime, just in case you feel you may forget a question as she's presenting, you can put it right in the chat box. And myself and my colleagues, will be sure to compile those questions and get to them during that question and answer session. So again, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Ms. Schillica Howard. Schillica is the current curator of collections at the National Civil Rights Museum located in Memphis, Tennessee. But if anyone is familiar with Schillica and her work and the museum, you'll probably know that prior to that, she was our curator of collections and exhibits. So we are just so excited to have her here on this platform today. And she'll be engaging in a really, really, really interesting conversation with Director Compton, who is, of course, the director of the Banneker-Douglass Museum and Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture. So thank you, and I will now hand the program over to Ms. Howard.
Hello, thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here for the Banneker-Douglass Museum and to discuss this topic. So I'm going to share my screen. If anybody has any questions about this presentation as well, that can go into the chat box as well as I am speaking. So I'm going to dive right in. So there are what I created about 4 steps for ways that you can preserve protest art and memorabilia that you have picked up along the way. This summer was a very historic summer with the protests around the murder of George Floyd, but additionally, Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So the first step is just talking about getting started. So what should you preserve? You can preserve anything that speaks to you, anything that you feel tells a story and contributes to the story of your experience. Oh, and also I want to note that there will be a resource sheet sent out to all the participants so that you all can take this information with you. But you can preserve anything that speaks to you: posters, signs, art, buttons, clothes. Here I have a picture of the retired Marine Todd Wynn, who knelt in protest of George Floyd's murder. Excuse my typo. But as you can see, his shoes were melting. So that's something that is very significant to the story that might want to, that should be preserved because they tell an interesting story. So the first step for actually preserving these items is to document. So you should document as much as you can. It's very important to have context for these items so you don't just have a t-shirt that you don't know where you wore it, or a flyer that you don't know what year things happened. And it's very important to document as much as you can. So you describe the object, answer the 5 W's that I'm going to get into a little further, and to take a photo of the object. So the first question is who. So things you might want to, questions that go along with this are, who attended the protest with you? Who is, if you have a photo, who's in the photo with you? Who was the protest for? Those type of questions. What was the name of the protest, if there was any name in particular, or what were you protesting? So here I have a picture of the Brooklyn Liberation March, which was also called the March for Black Trans Lives at the Brooklyn Museum this summer. When was the protest? When did you make your sign? When did you carry it? Did you carry it at multiple protests? When were those? Thinking about that and documenting that as well. Where was the protest? If it was a march, where did it start and where did it end? So I have a photo from someone's personal collection of the route of the Selma to Montgomery March. This is important because historically speaking, it's important to know the stops along the way, where the route was, what they may have encountered along the way in these different locations. And similarly, this is a map actually from Instagram from a driving protest that Out Memphis did, that took some historical stops along the way. And it was, like I said, a driving protest, and this was on Instagram. So this is actually a digital object. It's not a physical flyer, but it's still a flyer that was promoting this protest. So next, why? Why did you go to this protest? Why was the protest happening at all? For this piece of art, this is on the side of an artist studio. So that's important to know, as why is this mural here? It's because the artist, it's their studio, so it can't, or not it can't be destroyed, but if it were, it would be an issue. So just a note to describe any damage that happened to the object and how it happened. I know people who have been in protests whose unfortunately whose clothes have been ripped. That's important damage to the object that you might want to note, because it's an important part of the story. Journal about your experience with the object. So what was it like carrying this protest sign, or how did you feel when you put on a button that said Black Lives Matter, things like that. So here I have a bust of Breonna Taylor that was vandalized in Oakland, California after a few weeks. So even if that person, if somebody had taken a photo of it when it was first installed as a bust, a couple weeks later, it has a completely different context now because it's damaged by vandals who are racist. So that's an important part of the story that you want to have noted down. So the next step is handling. So when you handle your objects, even though it's probably something that you were out in the streets with, or was something that was okay to get dirty, when you are moving into preserving it, you should handle it with care, because now it needs to be taken care of to make sure that it lasts. So always wash your hands. With some objects, you should use gloves, but as long as your hands are clean, that's the most important part. Oils and oils that are in our skin can do a lot of damage as time moves on, where you can see to the point where you can see people's fingerprints on a sheet of paper years later. So work on a clean, dry surface. Water is also a huge method of damage for many objects that you will probably be working with. So make sure your surface is clean, make sure it's dry, that you won't be damaging your object before you even are able to preserve it. And keep all of your tools and materials nearby. You shouldn't have to run and grab things from all over the house, because you never know what can happen when you are away. Your baby can come and run around and grab your things, and it's just easier to have everything with you and prepared when you're about to move into the next step, which is housing. So on these next two steps, I highlight the differences between physical objects and digital objects. So physical objects are things like paper flyers, protest signs, works of art that you may have done. Digital objects are photos that you might have taken on your phone, or videos. Like I said, an Instagram post that I screenshotted that I wanted to save. Those are digital objects that have a completely different set of needs. So for physical objects, use acid-free archival products. These can range in price. On the resource sheet listed some places where you can purchase acid-free and archival products. They range in price depending on where you're getting them from and how large of items you need. Make sure all of your objects are well supported and protected from any form of damage. So that means light, water, fire, human interference, pests. Make sure they're completely protected, and store like items together. So if you have multiple buttons, put those together. If you have multiple flyers, put those together. Don't, except for plastics, those should be stored by themselves, because as they get older, they release different gases that can impact other things around them. So for digital objects, remember obsolescence. So obsolescence means that things, especially with media, they they become obsolete and we no longer use them. I put a floppy disk here because that is now obsolete. There is very difficult to come across a computer that has a drive for a floppy disk. So when you're trying to store your digital photos and videos, think about the long term and how you're going to be able to access these photos again in the future. So remember obsolescence, so stored in a reliable format and have more than one copy. So this takes us to the next step, which is storing. So location, location, location. If possible, avoid the attic and the basement. These are places that experience a lot of temperature changes and fluctuations throughout the year. And when it comes to basements, there may be water flooding that happens. So that can do a lot of damage, as I said before. So avoid those places if possible. So going more into detail for physical objects, consistency is key. So if you choose a location where it is consistently dark, the temperature and humidity are consistent, there's generally no pests, and that are unlikely to experience water or fire. Consistency is important because often fluctuations are what damage an item. So for instance, if you have a photograph that is in a place where it's very humid in the summer, but then becomes very dry in the winter, it can warp the actual image, do different things to the inks that are used, and can generally cause a problem. So even if if you store things in a place that are consistently a little too humid, that's better than a place that fluctuates between dry and humid, or really hot and really cold. So for digital objects, you should have 2 copies in 2 different locations. So I gave a few examples. You could have one physical copy, like one photo that you printed out, and one that you keep in the cloud. With a physical copy, you just treat it as you would any other photograph. You can have two physical copies, one that you keep at home and one you maybe give to a family member that you trust. You can have two digital copies, one on your hard drive and one in the cloud. Any two locations are great as long as you have access to them and they are complete copies. So that is it for my presentation. As I said, there will be a resource sheet that is available for you all with links. I also provided some resources about posting your objects online. So like if you have a video of a protest, how to like ethically post that online so that no one ends up facing criminal charges or anything like that if they're participating in peaceful protests. That's been an issue where protesters have faced charges because their information was posted online. So I included resources for that as well. And now I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I am going to bring Director Chanel Compton into the conversation to discuss the importance, or just to talk about why this is a hot topic right now.
Thank you so much, Shalisa. I'm definitely going to be looking at that resource guide and sending it to family and friends. And speaking of family and friends, one question that I did have is, you know, when I talk to my grandmother, right, or my mother who was born in 1960, and I asked them questions about times of protest. It's almost, particularly my grandmother, everything is pretty much based on memory. And when we talk about archiving and preserving protests and social justice movements, what would you say to people that would, their response would be, I mean, there's millions of people involved in this movement. Who am I? If I'm not going to donate this to a museum, or I don't plan to donate this to a museum, or what is the importance of me preserving this little piece of a story?
Yeah.
From their vantage point.
Right. It's extremely important to preserve social justice movements from an individual vantage point, because everyone, there's a variety of reasons actually. The first thing that came to mind is that everyone's experience is different. Why they came to a protest is different. How they experience the reality of the protest is different. So it's important to have those to distinguish those factors, because if somebody, like going back to the why, there may be a personal reason why, like if you were at a protest for regarding police brutality, like if that person had also experienced police brutality, that's important, and that's a big part of the story. Or even if they haven't and just feel moved for a different reason, that's another part of the story. And I feel like that's not something that we see in history books or anything like that. Well, first of all, it's the stories overall are generally lacking in when we learn history, but understanding the different reasons why people come out and their experiences with it vary. And I think that's an important part of the story. And that's an important reason why individual vantage points need to be documented. Also, not even for the larger population, but for your own family to know what was going on. Similarly, I just spoke with my grandmother. Actually, when she came to Memphis for to the National Civil Rights Museum for the first time, she was, there's an exhibit about the March on Washington, and we were there, and she told me that she was there at the March on Washington, and she had never told me that before. she didn't have anything. So it was, we talked actually yesterday about it, but it was all based on her memory. So it's important just for your own legacy and understanding your family's role in these movements as well.
I love that. It's like you're not only preserving the protest, you're preserving your legacy.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Right. Like this is if you think about, social justice movements, these are the times that define our generation and generations to come. And so preserving that legacy for your grandkids or your children or friends and family is incredibly meaningful for the people that you passed it down to. I'm sure you were like totally floored and amazed that your grandmother participated in that march.
Definitely. I was like, do you have anything? Of course, as I do collections and things, I was like, do you have anything? And she didn't. So I was like, you can't throw things like that away. You have to keep them. Anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really it really does define. I feel like it speaks to like your mindset at the time, who you are at the moment, looking back decades to say like, oh, that's what I was doing in my 20s or in my teen years. I was active in social justice movements. Can really mean a lot to a teenager or somebody, a youth in their prime who is able to go out and push these movements forward. So yeah, I think that's really important.
And as far as like passing things down, like you are a collection specialist, and I see we have other collection specialists in the room. We have Ida Jones from Morgan State University. Shout out to Ida. This is what you do on a day-to-day, but for someone that this isn't what they do, I would assume you're not encouraging people to, it's there's not this pressure of you have to preserve everything, right? It's this, what do you find special and what are those things that you want to pass down and leave as signifies of your legacy and in your participation in the movement.
Yeah, I don't believe in preserve. You can't save every piece of paper or every photo, but it is, whatever speaks to you and whatever you feel like tells the story from your perspective, or from your perspective. If a button is more important to you than a video, then delete the video. You don't have to keep it.
Yeah.
And you can't keep everything. You don't have the space. But I do feel like people are generally naturally keep things that are important. So this is just more of an intentional way of doing so that it's not lost in time or just tossed in a box in the attic.
Right. So just my second question is, we live in a digital age, right? So how would you respond to someone saying, well, I document everything on social media?
Yeah.
So what's the, you know what I mean? Like,
social media is hard because a lot happens on the internet, and it's an important place to be able to document things, but the internet is not, social media is not forever. And once you upload things to Instagram or Twitter, they can be removed, they can be deleted, and you don't have access to that anymore. Your account can be taken away, which we know, which is their right.
Yeah.
And it's gone unless somebody archived it. So it's important to have things other places. So if you do post a photo from a protest, that's great, but that's not archiving or preserving. That's sharing. That's providing access to other people, but there's no way to ensure that it will be around in perpetuity. Who knows if we'll have Instagram 50 years from now? And then, so what happens to all of our content? But you know, physically, if you have something, a file, that's easier to keep track of than a social media platform that belongs to a company. So yeah, I'm all about social media, but I think it doesn't serve the same purpose.
Very good point. So if Sabria, if you don't mind, I see that the question chat is like loading up.
It is. We are so happy about that.
Yeah, and I'm looking at some of the questions, and I'm like, these are really, really good.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I bounce it over to you, and you can read some of these questions? Because the goal is for this is to be as engaging as possible. And Schillica, I want to thank you for answering my questions for my selfish reasons, and I'm sure it was educational for the audience as well.
Yes. Thank you, Schillica and Chanel. And they are not leaving. You guys are not off the hook yet. These questions, I'm sure, are for you all. And Schillica, I'm going to be selfish with you at some point as well, because I have 35,000 pictures in my phone. And when it comes to where I start, I was actually sending my colleagues some pictures this weekend of just stuff I have from years ago in terms of protests that I've attended. So this is great. And I'm glad that we'll have that resource sheet to share with our attendees. But we are going to jump right into some of these questions. Thank you all so much for engaging with us. And this one is from Ellen Sherry. Any thoughts on how stories or narratives are best recorded to be passed on to future generations? Prompts such as how did you feel, who were you with, etc., that are likely to be most impactful for future generations.
Yeah, so I in the presentation I listed a few. I actually didn't include that on the resource sheet, so I'll go back and actually update that. But there are definitely, I definitely included some prompts. So, right, who were you with? Who were you protesting for? If you were at a protest for a specific person, why were you there? Why did you choose to go to this particular protest on this day? What was the name of the protest? Where was it? What was the route that you marched? Where did you learn about the protest? How did, like you said, how did you feel? What was your experience? So I think those are extremely impactful for future generations to get more of a full sense of the context of the object itself. So it's one thing to see a Black Lives Matter protest sign. There are tons of those, but the difference comes down to the meaning and the context of the individual protest sign. So even though there may be 50 different stories behind those. So that's very important to pass down to future generations. And I think a well-rounded story has more of an impact. I believe in objects. I love them very much, and they always have a profound impact, but it's only so far you can take an object without understanding why it's important. So yeah, those are mine.
Good. Okay. So I do have a question from Robert James that we are going to jump over and come back to, and I hope he doesn't get upset. I just want to make sure that we get to, Robert is one of our phenomenal colleagues, and Schillica could talk to him. I just want to make sure that we get to everyone's who typically wouldn't have that time with her. So Reverend Tamara England Wilson, who's also the chair of the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture. And I wanted to recognize Chair Wilson and any other commissioners or dignitaries and elected officials who are here with us today. Thank you so much for being here and always supporting the Banneker-Douglass Museum in our programs. So Dr. Wilson asks, can you offer a way for persons to preserve the oral histories of older family members who lived through protest movements, but may not have participated, but were still greatly impacted.
Definitely. I would say if you're in person, if you have, especially if you have like an iPhone or something like that, then you can just record a voice note. Or now that we're pretty much digital now, you can get on FaceTime or a Zoom call and ask whatever questions that you need to. I literally did this with my grandmother yesterday. We got on FaceTime and I just recorded our talk, and you treat that like a digital object. Make sure that you have 2 copies in 2 different locations. But I think recording is a great way to go. You can take notes on whatever stuck out to you and save those as well. If you want to type those up and put them in the same folder. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, just that it exists is helpful and better than if it didn't. So just however you can record it, whether it's just voice on a voice note or a video.
Good. Thank you, Schillica. And moving right along to our next question, and this one is from Commissioner Cheryl McLeod, who is also a commissioner on the Maryland African American History and Culture Commission. So welcome, Commissioner McLeod. When sharing your protest items with museums, et cetera, how do you retain your ownership? Great question. And control so that it cannot be confiscated and or used once shown to the public? For example, law enforcement, legal proceedings? Great question.
Yes. So in a museum, if you donate your objects to a museum, you no longer have ownership or control. So that is something I do want to highlight as a museum professional, that you transfer your ownership to the museum once it's donated. What you can do is loan it for a specific purpose or keep it. So once a lot of museums are discussing ethics in protest materials. So how do museums go about saving photos of protests that show people's faces and like you said, may make them vulnerable to law enforcement. I actually added a couple resources about this on the resource sheet, but there's a tool right now that actually is called BLM privacy, that if you upload a picture, it puts a little Black Power fist over everybody's face so that you can't, they're not distinguishable. But if you don't share it on social media, or there's no way for people to know that you have something like that. If you do post it on social media, I suggest removing the metadata. This is the whole process, but I know there's a couple apps that you can remove identifying information from your photos online. So, when you post a photo, all of the data goes up with it, including like your GPS location, what type of phone you have, what time it was taken, all of that information goes with it. So there are tools to remove that information to make it less identifying that it's you. So there are tools for that. But if you are concerned about control and ownership, I would suggest not donating it to a museum or showing it to the public, because especially once it's on the internet, you don't have any control over what's happening to it.
Interesting. And I see, hello, Martha, how are you? I see Martha added a picture of a button that she had from the Poor People's Campaign March. Did you want to tell us more about that, Martha?
Well, yes, I was still living in Boston, which is my hometown. And I came down on an overnight bus with a whole crowd of people to go to this march. None of us knew at that time that we were in the last few weeks of Martin Luther King's life, of course. We didn't know he would be killed in Memphis in just a matter of, I think, a couple of weeks, as I recall. And so we came down, and for me, it was really interesting because the march represented to some extent King's broadening of his interest beyond civil rights issues, because we had just had the Voting Rights Act, we just had the Civil Rights Act of the mid 1960s with Lyndon Johnson as president. And so now he was beginning to think more broadly about the economic and social and economic condition of Black people in particular. And I was really interested in that. So it was a wonderful march on the Mall, just very similar to the 1963 march, I guess. I wasn't able to go to that one, but it's now exciting for me as my grandchildren become old enough to understand and want to learn more about this, and are writing book reports on Dr. King, that their grandmother actually heard him speak and participated in these things. So it's really exciting for me. And if you folks want this button for any reason at the museum, I'm happy to donate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Martha. Martha is a great friend to the museum, and thank you for supporting us and always supporting all of our programs and initiatives.
You're welcome.
And I wanted to just to recognize the multiple abilities of individuals. So if there is anyone who's not able to type a question into the chat box and wanted to unmute themselves and ask a question, feel free to do so now. Again, wanting to recognize all of our multiple abilities. Okay. And if not, I guess we're going to wrap up here, which is actually just right on time. Again, our Lunch and Learn series are really quick, ways for us to share meaningful information with the public, especially since we can't be with you all in person. We really get excited about preparing these events and then just coming on, and if not seeing your faces, then seeing your names. Schillica, thank you so much for this. We called on Schillica to do this program, and she agreed with no problem. So thank you so much for always sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us at the museum and the public in general. Of course, Director Compton, thank you for being you. Thank you for your vision. Thank you for your direction. We appreciate you so much at the museum. And then, of course, I see our communications extraordinaire, Mr. Robert James, who keeps all of our communications going out, and our fabulous administrative manager, Mr. LaRon Herbert. Thank you for being you and just keeping things running while we are all in our multiple places. So I'm just going to scroll down and make sure I didn't miss any messages. Thank you all, and we will be sharing. Schillica has produced an amazing resource guide. It's just a 2-pager infographic, and we'll be sharing that with you all. And stay tuned for our upcoming programs and events. And thank you for coming.